going on 13 years. We still have no answer. We still don't know who Amber's killer is.
Tonight, Amber Tuccaro's family updates her case in Edmonton.
Qu'attendez-vous pour nous écouter et être réellement nos alliés?
A new petition calls on Quebec to recognize systemic racism.
So bringing it home has been a long journey, and to have it here for our people is so meaningful.
And a piece of Mi'kmaq history is coming home. Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. The family of Amber Tuccaro, chiefs, and the RCMP are again pleading with the public for anyone to come forward with knowledge of Amber's disappearance and death. 21-year-old Amber Tuccaro was last seen August 18, 2010 near Edmonton, Alberta. A man's voice was captured on a call from her phone but has never been identified. 2 years later, her remains were found in a wooded area near Leduc, just south of Edmonton. The RCMP apologized for deficiencies in how they handled her case in 2019. Tuccaro's family says many of the issues they experienced persist to this day.
For the RCMP or whoever takes the information, when a parent reports their child missing, put yourself in their shoes and think, well, what if that was me? What if that was my child? And I get told, oh, they'll come home in their den party. Just give that a thought. It's going on 13 years. We still have no answer. We still don't know who Amber's killer is.
We heard a mom who's hurting and a family and a community that's devastated by what happened. So I would say this, the people that are out there that know, that have information, no matter what they think that is, I would ask them to come forward as well. This investigation is not going, it's not stopping, and this family's commitment to making change is not going to stop either. So I would like to reassure you that from the top of this organization, that we're committed to moving this investigation forward and will continue to do so.
These two members died in service and protection of our community.
Still in Edmonton, where the police service is mourning the loss of two constables who were shot and killed early this morning while responding to a domestic dispute. The two officers who were shot and killed overnight were identified later this afternoon. 35-year-old Constable Travis Jordan and 30-year-old Constable Brett Ryan were killed just before 1 a.m. local time, where they were responding to that call. The officers arrived at an apartment building around 12:45 a.m. and were shot by an unidentified male suspect shortly after approaching the apartment unit. Police say the male suspect is also dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. A woman was injured in the incident and has been taken to hospital with life-threatening injuries. Quebec Native women tabled a 4,000 signature petition Thursday at Quebec's National Assembly, calling for the François Legault government to recognize systemic racism in the province. Quebec's government has refused to acknowledge the existence of systemic racism, despite it being indicated in the coroner's report on the death of Joyce Echaquan, an Atikamekw woman who filmed herself before she died in hospital in 2020, as healthcare workers directed racist remarks toward her. And in a 2022 report that documented widespread forced sterilizations of First Nations and Inuit women in Quebec, Quebec Native Women President Marjolaine Etienne said the denial of systemic racism is preventing progress.
Monsieur Lafrenière, Monsieur Legault, qu'attendez-vous? Qu'attendez-vous pour nous écouter et être réellement nos alliés, vous aussi?
Well, have you experienced racism in institutions in Quebec or any other province or territory? We'd like to hear from you. You can send us your emails to news@aptn.ca or leave a comment on aptnnews.ca. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. For the last 20 years, a photo was the only image of Mi'kmaq regalia on display at a cultural centre in Millbrook, Nova Scotia. Now, after sitting in an Australian museum for 130 years, that regalia is coming home. Angel Moore brings us that story.
This is a photo of Mi'kmaq regalia on display at the Millbrook Cultural and Heritage Centre. Heather Stevens was a student at the centre about 20 years ago and asked where the real regalia was.
Because at first I was told it was none of my business. And so me being a First Nations woman being told, you know, it's not none of your business, well, it is. So when I actually took over the management position here, that's when I started to take that role on. I'm like, yes, it is my business. I'm going to move forward and I'm going to get this back.
Today, Stevens is the manager of the centre, and next week she is flying to a Melbourne museum to bring the regalia home.
It's been a very long time that that I was working on this. So bringing it home has been a long journey, and to have it here for our people is so meaningful.
Repatriating the regalia included Stevens appearing at the Canadian Heritage Committee 5 years ago for C-391, an act for a national strategy for the repatriation of Aboriginal cultural property. The act was tabled and dropped when an election was called, but Stevens persevered.
Again, and that's when I knew I have to spearhead this. I have to get this piece back home. And so I've done it.
Stevens says the regalia, made by a Mi'kmaq woman from the Sipekne'katik or Millbrook First Nation during the 1840s, was commissioned by Samuel Haigu, a Canadian civil servant who died in Australia in 1891. He left the regalia to Museums Victoria, where it has been stored for the last 130 years.
Because a lot of our artifacts are actually stored in drawers that nobody is able to see, and that's not what our ancestors would have wanted.
Stevens, working with experts, says the regalia will be protected as well as any museum.
It is an understatement for our Mi'kmaq people about not being able to know how to care for things, and if they're in a certain museum right now, leave them there because they know how to do it properly. That is a misconception altogether. So we have the technology here to be able to do that.
The repatriation will include ceremony. A specialized case to preserve the regalia will be the feature display at the centre.
So having it here not only means having people come in and share our history with us, but it also starts to have the spiritual, cultural connection to our ancestors.
The regalia is expected to be revealed to the public in ceremony on National Aboriginal Day, July 21st. Angel Moore, APTN National News, Millbrook First Nation.
And I'm sure Angel will be there for that reveal. Quite the efforts by Heather and all involved. Time to take a quick break. Still to come, tenants in the Northwest Territories have a new ally.
I tell them I don't want to hear excuses, so I don't bother phoning.
Welcome back. In the Northwest Territories, there's very little protection for renters and few places to turn for those facing illegal evictions, rent hikes, and more. But a new nonprofit is hoping to change that. Our reporter Charlotte Moore-Jacobs sat in on the meeting in Yellowknife with housing advocates. Here's that story.
It's not the warm welcome anyone hopes for, but it's Annie Thrasher's reality for the last 7 months. 2 windows broken and boarded up. The Inuvialuit mother and grandmother is a client of Yellowknife's public housing and lives in Lanky Court Apartments. In every corner of the unit, there's issues.
And you can see the ice, so it drains into here. I think it was like $75 to get the home defense spray, so we got it treated that, it just wouldn't work.
The building is owned by Northview Right, a company which has had a monopoly on market rentals across the 3 territories for decades.
They tell me I don't want to hear excuses, so I don't bother phoning. I'll just wait. It's got to be done within 10 days, but they tell me since September, okay, we don't have the windows, we have to order them, and because of COVID, and that was the last excuse, but I got in touch with them.
But Thrasher may get some relief soon, thanks to the Tenant Association of the NWT, a brand new organization advocating and helping renters navigate the legal system. On March 11th, founder Lisa Thurber chaired their first meeting.
It means that if we all come together and file an application with the rental office, and we had 70%, 75% of a building apply to withhold the rent from the landlord, then we would be able to get the landlord's attention. We want these common areas fixed. We want the dryers and the washers. There's Birchwood right now without heat and with facing rental increases, and we can't stop the rental increase. And in my opinion,
the association aims to protect tenants from issues such as unjust evictions, overdue repairs, rent hikes, and landlord retaliation.
We're looking for people that live in specific apartment buildings to be what we call building captains, so they can come to a board meeting, or they can...
In most of Canada, these types of advocates exist, but without one in the NWT, Thurber says renters have had uphill battles to file complaints with their landlords, mostly Housing NWT, the Territorial Public Housing Corporation.
Should the government of the Northwest Territories be the housing provider, or should they be the regulator of housing? They should be going after the corporate landlords like Northview, to say, fix your building.
Thurber says with over a dozen clients so far, she's hopeful the association can produce action from Housing NWT and Northview. Back in Lanky Court, Thrasher has plans to meet with the association, and until their windows are fixed, she'll keep her oven on to stay warm.
We shouldn't have to live like this year 2023.
APTN was unable to obtain an interview with Housing NWT by airtime. Charlotte Moore-Jacobs, APTN National News, Yellowknife.
And APTN News was unable to obtain an interview with Housing NWT in time for air. A group of Kaska people in the Yukon was amalgamated into another band against their will in 1956. And as Sarah Connors tells us in part 2 of her series on the Pelly Banks people, they now want the federal government to reinstate the original band.
And Pelly Banks is here, right in here.
Tesloa Smith is the Crow clan leader of the Pelly Banks people, a people who have lived in the Pelly Banks and nearby Pelly Lakes area for thousands of years.
I grew up there till then, and we would go to, live out on the land. There's a lot of places in Pelly Banks that you can go, and we have fish and moose, caribou. And these are Pelly Banks people. There's Pelly Banks here.
But in the mid-1950s, their band was amalgamated with another, effectively erasing the Pelly Banks people in the eyes of the federal government.
There's an element to the story that hasn't been told. And it's the scattering that happened to the people.
Erica Gilson is the executive director of the Pelly Banks government. She says stories from the elders paint a troubling picture of how the federal government began disbanding the community. Children returning from residential school in the late 1940s were taken to the community of Ross River, forcing some parents to relocate so they could be closer to their children.
And it was directly because of the residential schools coming in and stealing Harold that they dismantled the community and they scattered the people.
Documents provided to APTN show by the early 1950s, the Department of Indian Affairs was already interested in reducing the number of bands in southern Yukon. Many reasons are listed for this decision, like improving integration efforts and moving communities closer to roads so they could find employment. In 1956, the department amalgamated 3 bands into other bands for administrative convenience. Pelly Lakes was one of them, and the band was amalgamated with what is now the Ross River Dinner Council. The Pelly Banks people say they were never consulted about the decision and claim they were wrongfully amalgamated.
And no matter what the federal government has done to them, they never left their land. They never relinquished their rights.
This is unfortunately not an experience unique to the Yukon.
Gabrielle Slowey is an associate professor in the Department of Politics at York University, where she teaches courses in Indigenous and Arctic politics. Though she's not familiar with the Pelly Banks people, she notes it was common for the Department of Indian Affairs to move Indigenous communities to more central areas for the purpose of administering them. That includes things like implementing provisions of the Indian Act and providing social welfare.
So this was sort of an expedient, judicious, cost-saving measure, if you will, regardless of where the community's geography was from or their ancestors were from. It was sort of an Indian Affairs directive to force settlements.
As a result of the amalgamation, the Pelly Banks people became scattered. Its descendants are now mostly members of the Ross River Dinner Council or Liard First Nation and the communities of Ross River and Watson Lake. Despite this, leaders like Smith have been working since the early 90s to have the ban reinstated by the federal government.
They did us wrong, so it's up to them to correct what they did to us, to our people.
One Pelly Banks member I spoke to said reinstatement is a touchy subject for some. For example, the chief of Liard First Nation told APTN if Pelly Banks was reinstated, it would impact their funding and services. But Smith says Pelly Banks wants to be reinstated in a way that won't impact other Kaska communities, and there is support in their efforts. Documents and by-council resolutions provided to APTN show Ross River and the Kaska Nation have supported the Pelly Banks government in their efforts for reinstatement throughout the 90s and as recently as 2019. While Ross River declined to comment on this story, the chief of Liard First Nation says Pelly Banks reinstatement would involve all of the Kaska Nation and would be dependent on what membership wants. Next up on Part 3, why the Pelly Banks people can do little without formal funding.
Our government receives $0, yet we function and we operate as a full government. And right now, we're fighting for the right to be.
APTN Investigates is continuing its look at life behind bars with a new episode this week. We've got a preview of that and more coming up after the break. Welcome back. Time now for our photo of the day. And with St. Patrick's Day just around the corner, little Bryden Castell of Puckatawagan is getting geared up to celebrate. Thanks to Evan for sending in that cute picture. You can send your pictures by email to share@aptn.ca for the chance to be our next photo of the day. Now let's take a look at Friday's weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, +5 with snow in Halifax, 8 in Fredericton. -12 with snow in Kuujjuaq, flurries and 3 below in Nain. +3 with snow in Montreal, 2 above and snow in Val-d'Or. +2 in Sault Ste. Marie, snow and 3 in North Bay. -9 with snow in Thunder Bay, 12 below and flurries for Sioux Lookout. -10 in God's Lake, snow and 9 below in Norway House. 10 below with snow in Winnipeg, -13 in Dauphin. -13 for Regina, 9 below in Saskatoon. -6 in Meadow Lake, sunny and 0 in Buffalo Narrows. Sunny in northern Alberta, +6 in Fort McMurray, 0 in Peace River. +4 under the sun in Edmonton, sun's out and 6 in Lethbridge. 11 above with sunny skies for Vancouver, 13 in Victoria and Kamloops. +6 in Prince George, 7 above for Smithers. -24 in Old Crow, +5 in Whitehorse. -2 in Yellowknife, -15 with snow in Norman Wells. 29 below for Sax Harbor, -25 in Paulatuck. -20 for Baker Lake and Chesterfield. -28 with snow in Resolute, cloudy and 21 below in Joe Haven. Okay, over to Ottawa now, where Annette Francis is standing by with a look at tonight's Nation to Nation, which will examine the phenomenon of adopting an Indigenous identity. It's often done to get a scholarship or a prestigious position in academia or the arts. But Métis lawyer Jean Taillé tells End to End that the problem is alarming and far more widespread than people think.
Coming up just after the news, we take a look at the red flags that come up when people claim Indigenous identity that's in doubt. We'll hear from Saskatchewan MLA Betty Nippy Albright and her reasons for asking the provincial legislature to take action. I also speak to Métis lawyer and author Jean Taillé, where she'll talk about the report she's prepared for the University of Saskatchewan about Indigenous identity fraud. And we'll hear from an award-winning First Nations hip-hop artist about his top-of-the-chart songs, Red Flag. Stick around, that's coming up after the news.
Looks great, thanks Annette. Tomorrow night on APTN Investigates, Rob Smith goes inside corrections. In 1996, John Derek Mills was arrested after an attempted armed robbery. Almost 30 years later, he's still behind bars. Mills says it's because he's still fighting some of his charges and refuses to back down. Here's a look.
Our crew at Investigates committed to this correction series because, well, the stats are simply outrageous.
It is shocking and it's a human rights violation.
Even criminal justice members are shocked. And in so many ways they're beside themselves and they don't even know what to do anymore.
John Derek Mills' story is both compelling and unbelievable. He's been in prison 28 years for a botched armed robbery and kidnapping.
I'm just gonna sit across from you. Your initial sentence was life 7, yeah. Life 7. Why are you still in jail?
I do want to get out of the jail, but I'm not going to admit to something that didn't happen or I didn't do in order to get out of the jail. And that sucks because I'm going to be in jail for a long time.
And Hard Time is the second story in the Inside Corrections series. The full episode airs tomorrow night right here after the news. To check out the whole series, including part 1, you can go to aptnnews.ca/our-stories/Inside Corrections. That is all the time we have for your APTN National News for this Thursday. For much more, you can visit our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for being with us. Stick around. Annette is up next with Nation to Nation. Have a great night.